Shall we start? Yes. Is this microphone working? See? Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I understand we have a fair number of people already joined us online, and a select but very special few in the audience here early this morning in Barcelona. So welcome, everybody. Bon dia a todos. We are delighted. My name is Saul Morris. I am the Director of Program Services at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. We work on all things food systems and including issues relevant to urban areas. And we're thrilled to be here this morning looking at the question of how cities might shape climate resilient and healthy food futures for all. An extremely relevant topic for this conference happening here this week in Barcelona. I'm joined by our moderator, who is Assistant Professor Min Cho. She's Assistant Professor of Global Health at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and she will be managing all of the speakers and will introduce our excellent speakers to you in a moment as we run through the agenda. And we have really a fantastic panel for you this morning, looking at a variety of different urban contexts from the African continent and talking about their experiences, trying to adapt to the changing climate. So our focus this morning is dual, as the title suggests. We're looking at the issues of climate resilience, and of course many cities have had to really think about what they're going to do to change the way that they're organized and run as we begin to confront the challenges of climate change. But we're also thinking about how that affects what people eat and how relevant that is for their nutritional status. So there's always that tension between trying to meet both of those needs, facing up to the climate challenges and the livelihoods challenges that brings, as well as the nutritional challenges. And cities are perhaps the key place where we need to meet these challenges, because by 2050, 70% of food will be consumed in cities. They are essentially the food environment of the future. What is food environment? It means the place where people, us, meet food. And since most people are going to be in urban areas, most of that meeting with food is going to happen in urban areas. And so what cities choose to do in their policies and the way that they organize their spaces is of critical relevance to changing the trajectory that we're on. I think without more ado, I'm going to pass over so that we keep a maximum amount of time for our speakers to share their experiences. Min Cho, would you like to introduce our first speaker?
Thank you, Saul. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to our first speaker, Dr. James Battersby from University of Cape Town, where she will look into the context of Cape Town and this will be an online video Zoom session where she will introduce her talk.
Hey, good morning. Can you all hear me and see my screen?
Unfortunately, not.
No? Okay, I can see myself, but can you not see my screen still? Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Battersby from the University of Cape Town. Unfortunately, I'm in Cape Town, and I rather wish I was in Barcelona with you. So I'm providing a kind of introductory input into this session, and my work for the last 15 years or so has focused on urban food securities, food systems, and their governance in the African context. And so Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing continent in the world. And so often that urbanization is thought of as kind of imagined as being centered on the megacities, the Lagoses of the world, the Nairobis. And yet this graph from Peterson et al. Shows us just how much of that growth is happening in secondary and tertiary cities. And these cities have specific challenges in terms of governance capacity, infrastructure capacity, and land use trajectories. Another reality of African urban futures is this demographic transition and the youth bubble. And this poses significant challenges. We know there's challenges around youth unemployment and potential political instability. But it also provides this moment of thinking about innovation and change. we've also got to recognize that this urbanization is taking place in the context of rapid climate change. And both urbanization and climate change are going to fundamentally reshape our food systems. And so the key point is that we really need to be planning for our urban food futures and not just our urban presence. And so the question is today, how do we plan for resilient urban food futures, thinking about the food environment within our cities, but also the wider food systems that feed our cities? And we've got to understand that the food environment is in this dynamic relationship with consumers. The food environment shapes consumer activity, but also consumers shape and reshape the food environment. But both of these are being fundamentally shaped by wider urban processes, urban planning, urban governance processes. So thinking about the role of things like transportation planning, access to water and sanitation, planning of informal settlement upgradings, all of those fundamentally reshape the food environment and the consumer experience of that. And when we're thinking about the food system and the food environment, we've got to understand that these have multiple points of vulnerability and multiple points of resilience to climate change and to other threats. And so how do we start thinking about building a resilient urban food future? Well, I think the first point is trying to understand where those points of vulnerability and resilience lie. So this is a picture from Kitwe in Zambia, and it shows 3 products commonly consumed by the urban poor: eggs, cooking oil, that's what's in the Coca-Cola bottles, and tomatoes. And in Kitwe, you can get these products at the market, or you can get them at the supermarket. And these products have completely different pathways depending on where you get them from. And so it's a different source of production, it's a different mode of getting that product to the consumer, and consumers make different choices about where to buy them according to the needs they have, the finance they have, the access to infrastructure they have for cooking and storage and preparation. And if you think about these same products coming into the city and getting used by consumers in very different ways, we can see there's different points of resilience and different points of vulnerability in each of these flows along these different pathways. In other words, diversity supports resilience in the food system because each of those is vulnerable in different ways. And so if we're thinking about building resilient food systems, we've got to think about maintaining a diversity of food choices, maintaining a diversity of food types, so that if one type of food becomes unavailable due to a specific climate event or social unrest or trade restrictions, other foods are still accessible. And then there's a need for thinking about building supportive, equitable infrastructure that allows for diverse food sources, that allows for diverse food pathways. And finally, if we're going to build a resilient urban food system, we have to acknowledge the important role of the consumer and the local food system actors in building that resilience. And so resilience strategies therefore need to be inclusive of the end users and seek to build both household resilience and systemic resilience. We've got a plan for not some kind of idealized citizen, but an actual living, breathing person who lives, works, and has their being in the city. And so to close out, how do we get to this resilient food system? Well, I think firstly, there's a need for governments to work with the food systems they have and not to work towards an idealized, modernized food system, which is what we've seen so often in the work that we've been doing. We need policy and programs that are informed by lived experience, that acknowledge the complexity and diversity of the systems. And then finally, we need to have a set of principles that help to build systemic resilience by recognizing the need for multi-level governance. So many of the factors that are shaping our food environments happen beyond the urban boundaries. And so we need to have governance processes that are able to speak across those boundaries, difficult as that is. And I think some of the cases will talk about some of those challenges. We also need to recognize that this is a systemic issue, and therefore we need transversal governance. It can't be left to one department alone, and it can't be done within governance silos. And finally, the building of resilience needs to be inclusive of the residents of the city. We need to be in dialogue about food futures, develop collaborative planning and action. It's a hard pathway, but I think it's one that we're going to have to work towards if we're going to be climate resilient for 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Battersby, for that insightful aspect of the resilient future of the food systems. Speaking of climate-resistant future of the food systems, we will look into the video of Resilient Cities, Climate Change About Food in the example of City of Cape Town. while we're waiting.
The story of the drought is it stopped raining. Progressively, the dams didn't fill up. It was really scary. It was absolutely terrifying.
Day zero was a projected day that we would run out of water to the extent that we would have had to shut off the supply of water to all the households and businesses and require everyone to come and collect water in buckets.
It took people a while to twig what was actually happening, and it was just a progressive panic.
Civil unrest potential in such circumstances is enormous.
Day zero brought climate change home with a big slap. It kind of put a little bit of urgency onto people's actions and activities and behavior. You just assume that when you turn the tap on, water's going to come out of it.
Water is our limiting factor in terms of agricultural production in our province. When there was a massive reduction in water availability, that sector had to adapt. We were just focusing on what could happen if we did not succeed. And that was just too terrible for us to really contemplate. Well, certainly it's very difficult to change public behavior. We drove a program to persuade our populace to use less water. It was a mixture of information, persuasion, threats of increased water tariffs.
People were not taking it seriously. It was like, this has happened before, it's all going to be fine, water will continue to come out of the taps. And when the messaging changed to day zero, suddenly people were like, oh.
We constantly projected that if the current consumption rates were to continue, what was the day we would hit day zero? But as we achieved the better consumption figures, that day moved out. And so people could see the impact of the reduction in consumption and that their efforts were contributing towards that.
The residents of Cape Town were a big part, and their behavior were a big part of cutting our water by 50%.
Once that day moved into the winter rainfall, we just hit a point at which we were no longer projecting a day zero.
The important lessons from day zero was communication and messaging. Goodness, you have to get that right from the beginning.
It was a question of keeping the public fully informed so that they would believe us.
One of the problems with these big shocks and stresses and resilience is how do you make that relevant to every person and every household?
We succeeded by informing public, making them partners with us so that they buy into the program that we wish to drive.
Partnerships also extremely important.
Local government doesn't always have the capacity to cope with a major shock. So you need to have proper relations in place with them, proper understandings with them on how to react in these circumstances.
I think one of the outcomes of the drought has been the recognition that we need to plan for complete uncertainty. You know, there was always this thing of, oh, well, you know, there's never going to be a scenario where we're never going to have any rain. Now we actually have to consider that as an option.
When a disaster strikes, the key thing that you need to do is, first of all, having prepared yourself for these potential shocks. And are you then ready with a program, with systems in place to respond to it? Climate change, urbanization, technological change, globalization.
Drought, unemployment, poverty, urban health, and mental health is a really big one in Cape Town.
All of these issues are driving uncertainty and change, and so we need to be resilient to be able to cope with any stress and shocks that come to us.
As a city, we need to be thinking ahead, and how do we do that? We do it through a resilience lens.
So the Cape Town Resilience Strategy was developed coming out of the drought. We had a lot of lessons that we learned during that drought period, but this strategy is far beyond just looking at drought situations.
A lot of those bits and pieces that you put in place are the same bits that you'd put in place for any of the other shocks or stresses that would happen. For example, we are focusing on making Cape Town's food security more resilient.
A resilient food system is crucial to have nutrition for all of the people of the city.
One of the pillars that was identified, which then speaks to food security specifically, is the whole idea of a compassionate and holistically healthy city. Our goal is to make it possible for all Cape Townians to have access to nutritious, healthy food so that they can live the lives that they want to live.
The drought We learn our water supply only came from one source. What we need for the future is greater diversity of supply. All of those learnings from the drought will contribute towards better food production.
Resilience is something that must be integrated into every aspect of a city, whether it's spatial planning, financial planning, infrastructure planning. They all, in some way or another, interconnect and influence each other.
So if you're another city somewhere out there, the key thing that you need to do is, first of all, having prepared yourself for these potential shocks through a resilient strategy, diversifying, get your population on your side, and don't try and do it alone.
Yes, I think this video shows an excellent example of how we can prepare for the resilient futures and how preparation for the unknown and the shocks are crucial, as well as the communication. And to learn more about how resilient cities and resilient preparation is being done in Cape Town, we have our next expert speaker, Tamsin Faragher, the Principal Resilience Officer at the City of Cape Town, that will join us for the next talk.
Good morning. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully it's all going to go perfectly. Right. Is everyone good to go? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect, great. Okay, so thank you for that intro. I probably should have watched it before preparing because I might be able to skip a few of my 3 or 4 slides. But thank you so much for this opportunity to share a bit more of the City of Cape Town's food systems program. So to build on Jane's background and what you saw in the video as well, Cape Town is located at the bottom of the African continent. We're South Africa's second largest city. We have a population of about 3.2 million. As you heard, our food systems work is rooted in the resilience strategy, which came through the drought, so very much connected to climate and our climate response. And it looked at, how do we respond to shocks and stresses? It was a comprehensive bottom-up process that identified a number of issues, as we discussed, and there were various pillars that were identified. But one of the issues that came through very strongly was the question of food security. And it was embedded down in the action of a food systems program, which was launched earlier this year in July. So food and nutritional security is underpinned by social stresses, including high levels of inequality and spatial segregation that emanate from South Africa's apartheid spatial planning and policy, which we still live with every day to this day. This legacy results in unemployment and poverty that causes hunger, malnutrition, stunting, and NCDs. The figure on the right maps the vulnerability caused by the stresses that have been important informant to the COVID health and the humanitarian response. So understanding vulnerability is a very important part of resilience and how you respond in a crisis. The areas of high social vulnerability are the dark blue areas, largely overlap with the climate vulnerability areas, and these areas experience things like flooding and heat waves, etc. So Cape Town's adoption of the food systems program is a bit of an anomaly in South Africa because food security and food systems are typically seen as national, provincial government mandates. So in many ways, the work that we're doing is exploring uncharted territory. However, that said, we have an amazing base to work off that was provided by the provincial government. And we've been very generously supported through a working group that is comprised of academics such as Jane, NGOs and other spheres of government, as well as in other city partners such as ICLEI and the C14. So the first step to preparing the food systems program was to understand the problem. What is the problem and how do we then intervene? So this diagram is a synthesis that assisted in the identification of the risks, the opportunities, and the constraints in Cape Town's food system. You'll see on the diagram that it largely follows a supply chain format, but it also tries to represent quantums. It tracks food entering and exiting the food system and portrays changes throughout the process. Using this metabolism method, risks such as the high proportion of production inputs at the bottom of the screen, as well as the waste outputs, and then what you can't really see necessarily is the incredibly important role that the informal sector plays in supplying food in informal and township areas where most of Cape Town's vulnerable community live. So a bit of analysis of the diagram, we concluded that on the one side we have surplus, but on the other side we have people who are hungry and there's poor nutrition and poor health. So the question then becomes one of access, and why is there an access problem? The other thing we noted is that the system is very linear, it's not circular, and it's poorly optimized. So perhaps if we can optimize the system better, we can start to improve access on the left-hand side. Having done that analysis, we then looked at the city's mandates, and we noticed that there are three particular areas where the city has the largest leverage. The one is at the top in the manufacturing and the production space. The second is in the access and the retail space. And then lastly, the solid waste management at the bottom. Through the mandates analysis, we identified over 40 activities that the city is already doing in the food system space, which then starts to very firmly dispel this whole notion that local government doesn't have a role in food security or food systems. We also need to acknowledge that, we're talking about resilience, and these are the principles of resilience, which are, robustness, redundancy, flexibility, and resourcefulness. And I think one of the beautiful things about resilience thinking is that we acknowledge that it's a process. This is not an end state. This is a system, as Jane said, that is affected and massively by things that happen around it. So, it's climate change, it's financial issues, it's pandemics. And our question that we keep asking ourselves is, what will the system do in a particular scenario, so that we can then plan forward? So two prominent themes that are aligned with climate change and food environments are the two on the screen. The one is to promote sustainable production, which talks about sustainable farming and enabling a circular economy for food production. The second one is the question of spatial and economic access and using environments for that. So we've been looking at a food sensitive planning that looks at spatial planning through the city at various scales, and then also stimulating the local food economy across both the formal and informal sectors. So even though we are a new program, we only launched in July, we've already started making progress towards integrating food systems thinking into the city's policy, and we are encouraged by the support that we are already receiving across the city scales. And I believe that food environments is not something that is limited to a neighborhood scale, but reaches into the very heart and bones of how our city is structured, especially as it scales up and contributes to climate change. So where do we want to be in 2050? Hopefully very far from 2021. But we're talking about a food system that aspires to create the capacity to draw on food sources from multiple geographical regions, including global, national, and regional sources, without being dependent on any one source. It draws on diversified food supply chains comprised of low-carbon, large and small-scale production and distribution systems, and commercial and community-based sources. It's a circular system that has a capacity to draw on waste streams, such as wastewater, food waste, and organic waste, as inputs into food production. It is able to create synergies and achieve multiple benefits across a range of policy objectives, such as increasing access to nutritious food and creating jobs. And lastly, it is a people-centered and inclusive, placing people at the heart of the food system, ensuring that they benefit from increased access to healthy, sustainably sourced food and employment, and offering opportunities to engage actively with the food system as citizen consumers. I thank you.
Thank you, Tamsin and Faragher, for that insightful aspect of the resilient future of Cape Town and how systems thinking is the crucial element in terms of understanding the cause of the problem, but also the potential future solutions. And we now look into other cities' context, and we have our expert speaker, James Kalundu from the city of Windhoek, where he will give us another example of the resilient cities, climate change and food environment with the example of city of Windhoek. James?
Yes.
James is the manager of social and youth development in the city of Windhoek.
Good morning, everyone. and thank you very much for inviting the City of Windhoek to come and be part of this auspicious event where we will be discussing as cities the issue of food environment, climate, and resilient urban futures for all. I'll be going straight into stating that Windhoek has a very challenging climate. We are over 1,700 meters altitude with frost in winter and high temperatures in summer. Extreme events such as persistent drought, flash floods result in food insecurity and high rates of chronic malnutrition. It also brings to us the challenge of lack of food, poor rainfall in rural Namibia, which triggers the rural-urban drift in search of jobs and opportunities. And of course, we as a country or the capital city, the central government is responsible for the overall food security. The local authority, which is the City of Windhoek, has then the leadership and the responsibility in ensuring that the well-being of the urban inhabitants is taken care of. The City of Windhoek signed the proclamation, or rather the memorandum with MUFPP, and committed itself to be a leader in urban food and nutrition security in Namibia. That was in 2014, where all the mayors had met and took the issue of food insecurity to another level. Well, Namibia as a country is affected by extreme temperatures, the changes in the precipitation. We no longer get the same type of or quantity of rain that we would normally get in the past, which also brings about the issue of high evaporation rates. What have we done as a city to remain resilient, especially with food futures for all? We've embarked upon the water-wise agriculture, meaning we've started to harvest rainwater. Whenever it comes, we get our rains between now and April. We harvest the rainwater. We also use semi-purified water for our gardening. We support our soils with compost. We engage in agricultural methods that are requiring less water usage. That is now the permaculture method, using the contours and swells and compost, mulching, and soil coverage to ensure that we do not lose more water into the sky. And of course, we are also looking at growing crops that are well suited for local climate. How did we capacitate our local communities in order for them to remain resilient? We have started a program where we have trained at least 100 community members, that is in the area of permaculture and horticulture, to capacitate them to be able to use water wisely, to apply the correct methods that will, in any case or in any event, reduce the evaporation into the sky. It is a program that we have been running for 3 years now, and we are having some success stories in the area that would look at food security and nutrition system as a project already launched. We are governed by council, and for us to have started the program, obviously we had to get council resolution on establishment of this food security and nutrition system project in the city. As you may be aware that it's a relatively new concept, 3 years going to 4 years now. And of course, we cannot manage without the involvement of the stakeholders. Therefore, a steering committee was established. With that, we came to the establishment of our community gardens, backyard gardens, as well as different informal settlement settings where we encourage our informal settlements to do some irrigation on their backyards. In Namibia, for example, the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold could be breached within the next decade and maybe double 2 decades later, which will mean the annual rainfall will reduce by at least 7%. The mean temperature is likely to increase at least by 2.7 degrees Celsius. Evapotranspiration will increase at least by 10%, and groundwater recharge rate will reduce by up to 70%. And of course, coming back to the production in the livestock productivity reduction could be up to 20% down. And of course, 30% of the species could be lost due to high temperatures and lack of water in some cases. What will Namibia or Windhoek be in the next 50 years if these projections are to continue? Of course, it will have a devastating impact on the livelihoods of our cities' residents. And we would like to be a city, if these were to be removed as obstacles, we would like to be a food hub for the entire nation in 50 years. We would like to be exporting at least 60% of our produce to other countries that may need them. And of course, we would like to use agriculture to employ. By the way, it is still one of the leading employers in the country. Agriculture employs quite a number of members, but we would like to increase that and create income for our residents. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that fascinating insight in terms of City of Windhoek and how you are actually coping and fighting for the resilience of the City of Windhoek, especially with the wise use of water and also adopting to the local culture. So thank you for that. And now we're going to look into the next city with our speaker, Winfred Katumo, where she's the Principal Agriculture Officer of City of Nairobi. And she will be speaking about the resilient city, climate change, and food environment in the city of example of City of Nairobi.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Yes, welcome to Nairobi. As I talk about Nairobi, Kenya, we are a city, we are about 6 million people. And by the year 2050, we might double the number to about 14 million. And due to this high population, which is growing at a high rate, we need to feed our people. We need to be food secure in the city. And as a city, we have put down some measures to make sure that food is available for the citizens of Nairobi. And what we are doing is we are intensifying urban agriculture through some initiatives. I've given out some photos, if they can be projected, okay? We are intensifying some food production using microgardens. These microgardens, they use less water. And even as we intensify the production, we are looking at how can we be responsible so that we don't pollute the environment with inorganic chemicals. How can we be careful so that we can use clean water? So that's why we are using the microgardens to intensify the production. You can look and see them. Those are microgardens. We call them corn gardens. We also have moist beds. We have multi-story gardens. And in addition, we are also promoting the use of greenhouse so that we can have food throughout the year. You can also see those are other micro gardens, use of containers. And also we are trying to be sensitive to the environment because these containers, especially now the water bottles, after taking water, they're supposed to be thrown away, but we are recycling them and putting them into better use so that we can promote crop production in Nairobi. Beside crop production, we are also promoting the keeping of the small animals, like the rabbits, the poultry. Again, they consume less water. And as you know, I think all over the world, there's the global warming. The climate has changed. We have now less water for production. So we really have to intensify on these technologies, on these initiatives, which require less water. This is a simple drip irrigation using the bottles. Once they are unlocked up there, once you open the lock there, there's enough pressure, which now waters the crops downwards until it reaches the ones which are grown on the ground. Number two, even as we look at intensifying the production, we also have to minimize the wastage or the loss of the food. In Nairobi, we are producing about 20% of the food which is being consumed. About 80% comes from outside the city. Those are from the peri-urban areas, the peri-urban towns. And once we are promoting this, we want to upscale so that we can go up to about 25%. But however, the food which is coming into Nairobi is a lot, 80%. And we have also realized out of that, about 4% goes into wastes, or it is lost in a certain manner. Maybe people bring in a lot of it. Maybe it's damaged on the way. Along every component of the food system, there's a bit of food waste. And as Nairobi, we want to see how can we pilot. We want to see how do we pilot a food recovery program. That is something which we are working on so that we can pilot it, and of course, in collaboration, in partnership with other private sectors, so that we can lower this wastage. Maybe from 4, we can bring it down to about 2%. By 2050, when we look at the food waste, we want to have a formal waste recovery system in Nairobi. There's a lot of food, as I said, which goes into wastes all over the component of the food system. Looking at the restaurants, sometimes they have a lot of food which is not finished, and this is food which can be recovered, and then we can have maybe some picking points for those vulnerable families. Those people cannot afford food. The hotels, we as a city want to see how do we come together with the private sectors, everyone who is involved in the food system, so that we can even have picking points of this food. Looking at the markets, I think there was a photo on the food waste. We see how do we also recover this food before it is dumped. There are people who go to the dumping sites to do scavenging. And this scavenging, the food which ends into these heaps, those heaps, sometimes that is good food, which can be consumed by other people. So we are looking at how do we save this food so that we can bring it back into the chain of human food consumption. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Winfred, for the example of City of Nairobi in terms of intensifying urban agriculture and also reduction of the food waste and how we can intensify the microgardens for the better production. So we have looked into so far the city of Cape Town. We have looked into the academic perspective of how we can build resilient cities when it comes to food systems. And we have also looked into the city of Cape Town, the example of resilient cities with the Day Zero. And we have city of Windhoek and city of Nairobi. Now that we have heard from the expert speakers, we will open the floor for discussion, where we will have open engagement for the next 40 minutes. We would first like to welcome all the audience here for any questions that you may have or any of insights that you may want to hear further from these experts. And we also have our online presentations and audience that would like to ask the questions. So I would first like to invite our audience here from the floor if you have any questions or comments. Please feel free to ask any questions. Well, while we are waiting for questions from online, I would like to hear from the city of Windhoek in terms of how is the wise use of water being adopted in the city of Windhoek. Could you elaborate more on that in terms of the wise use of water and the local empowerment aspect?
Thank you for a very important question. I also want to highlight the fact that Windhoek City has one of the world-renowned reclamation plant for water. 70% of our water is reclaimed water. And it has given the city lots of awards worldwide. Very safe to drink. It goes through 24 stages before it's consumed. That's number one. Number two, we are a desert country, meaning water is very scarce, high temperatures, and when it rains, it quickly runs on the hard surfaces and either evaporates or runs into the sea, which is Atlantic Ocean. Now, when we are introducing water into our gardens, first of all, we have the fresh water, and then we have the semi-purified water. And of course, then the rainfall water, which comes from just about now until April. So we try to improvise and make use of the water at all different stages in a sustainable manner. In as much as our gardens require fresh water, we deliberately focus on using the semi-purified water or the harvested water. So we are empowering our communities to harvest at their household. We are also encouraging our community members in the urban areas to use grey water, water from the kitchen, and catch it up and make use for the backyard garden. And when it's practically possible at our gardens, we do not do the normal or the conventional gardening where we splash water, but we rather use systems that are maybe permaculture, meaning using the contours and making sure that we do not necessarily disturb the nature. And also the drip irrigation is one. We also improvise and make use of our greenhouse, which allows us to catch the water. So it has been working for us in so many ways that we are able to do much with less. And also we make use of our composting, which predominantly should be organic in its format. And we use mulch to avoid or reduce evaporation. And of course, this cannot just fall from somewhere. It has to be through capacity building, where we train our community members to be water-wise in terms of producing. And I hadn't seen the pictures, but there were pictures that we had of our gardens, which are green, and always have food for the table using those methods. Thank you.
Thank you. Would that be also the case in the city of Nairobi, how the use of water also increases the food production and how that also impacts on the food access? Could you explain a bit more in how the city of Nairobi?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, as I talked about Nairobi, we are promoting the initiatives which are using limited water. Those are the micro gardens. And as you saw on the photos, we are promoting simple irrigation. I think you have seen the one for Botros. As we are promoting greenhouses, we are also encouraging the suppliers of the greenhouses to bring along gutters so that we can harvest rainwater. The city, when we are supporting the community or the groups, capacity building them, as we purchase the greenhouses, they come together with the water harvesting tanks. So we do a lot of rainwater harvesting. There's also the boreholes, which supplement the city, the municipality water, because we have water which is piped all over. But to supplement that, we are also having the boreholes. We also, as my friend has said, we also promote, we train them on mulching so that we can conserve the little water which you are pouring on the crops. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for both of the cities in terms of how you manage the challenges of the climate and the water challenges. I would like to now focus more on the food and nutrition aspect with the example of City of Cape Town, how you actually tackled the vulnerability of nutrition and the inequality of the food access when it comes to Day Zero, for example, and how we can, how Cape Town has tried to, overcome these challenges when it comes to food access and food vulnerability in the example of Day Zero. So, Tasman, would you first like to? Yes.
Sure. So what was interesting about the drought is that it didn't actually affect food access. I mean, the drought did affect crops. So, for example, some of the fruit didn't grow to the full size that it would normally, so we had undersized fruit. But it did, so from a food access perspective, it didn't really have a massive impact. The impact was predominantly on agriculture, and even that wasn't as significant as we had feared. We did manage to bounce back quite quickly. What it did do from a production perspective is there's nothing like a crisis to force a bit of innovation, and there was a lot of innovation that happened coming out of the drought in terms of using water, and not just for the production, but also in improving the manufacturing processes to bring water consumption down, and also looking at different water supply sources. So, I mean, some of the big companies installed RO plants and treated water on site, water being treated effluent. So they optimized their production lines in order to reduce the municipal demand and then replace where they were able to do safely with treated effluent, or even treated effluent that they then retreated, or just treated effluent. So anything that happened outside, washing surfaces, etc., could be done with treated effluent. So there were a lot of there was an amazing amount of innovation that came out of that. But in terms of food access, it wasn't a particularly big impact. And I mean, from a water perspective, though, On the particularly vulnerable, the city took a decision not to limit water because, in fact, poor people use a lot less water than wealthy people do. They use less than they're actually allocated in many instances. I mean, to carry a 25-litre bucket, which is what effectively we almost ended up with, is hard work, you know. So if you're going to carry 25 litres, you're going to make sure you use it in many different ways before you throw it away, if you throw it away. So there weren't any, the informal, the most vulnerable had access to water as they would have had before the drought, in fact. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Tamsin. We have a question from the floor. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to also make a couple of comments on the question about wet water issues. The large numbers of farmers...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Sorry, yeah, I'm Gordon Prain. I'm working with the CGIAR, which is an international network of agricultural research centres, and we're developing an initiative on resilient cities, working in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia and Latin America. So we know that many farmers in different cities in sub-Saharan Africa are using wastewater for irrigating their crops. And it has many advantages. It's one of the nutrient benefits of the city. It contains organic solids and it also contains nutrients. But it also contains pathogens. So there's a lot of work being done on how to make that water less risky. And this is very much connected to the food environment. I mean, the food environment is also about food that's safe or food that is not safe in the farm gate or in the markets. So, I mean, my question is to the presenters, is there any effort being made to use some of the methods, sedimentation, reduction of splashing effects, which have been developed to reduce the risk factors, the health risk factors in wastewater use in any of the cities that we've heard about?
Should we start with the city of Nairobi?
Thank you once again. For Nairobi, 2 years ago, that use of contaminated water for irrigation has been there. And 2 years ago, what we did, we took those people who were using that water, and we sampled some of the crops which were grown using that water. And we took the samples for testing, because it is good when you are sensitizing people, it is good you show them practically what it is. So when we took them for testing, we realized those crops and even the fodder for the livestock contained a lot of heavy metals. We had chloride, we had zinc, among other heavy metals. So from there, we embarked on awareness, now creation, using the results, because we involved those people who were already in it. And for the last 2 years, those people who were engaging in that practice of using the untreated water, the number has now gone down, because we intensified sensitizations, we intensified the awareness creation using now the results from the lab. So that is what we did. Otherwise, the number has gone down. So far, we have not gone into use of the untreated water. It is underway, and we're looking at 2050, we shall be there.
Thank you, City of Nairobi. James, could you give an insight?
Thank you. I think that was a very good observation. I must state here that, of course, at the initial phase of our project, we had issues with our health control officers in regards to the usage of water, which we had discouraged from day one. It is something that is not permissible. And of course, where there are semi-purified lines, normally there would be scientific studies carried as to determine the type and the quantities of pathogens that could be available. And of course, there are those that are totally not allowed to be used for food production. And with that, we have now decided to go the route of drilling boreholes, using the natural water for our irrigation, and using less of the clean water for our gardens. We take cognizance of the fact that the pathogens could, in the long run, be a very serious repercussion to the people that we serve. So it is something that we are really looking at, and it's being monitored at every stage of our water supply.
Tasman, we have a hand up from Dr. Battersby.
Thank you. I just wanted to also extend the conversation about water quality beyond the production question. I think we need to think about how water integrates into all aspects of the food environment and food security and nutrition security. So at the moment, we're doing work within Cape Town and one of the cities outside of Cape Town, working with low-income women, looking at how different systems shape their food practices. And the question of accessibility and quality of water is fundamentally shaping the choices that people are making in terms of what foods they buy, how they prepare them, and how they manage the safety issue. And so, one of the big challenges that's happening across urban Africa is the rapid diet transition and the rise of non-communicable diseases that Tamsin mentioned. And so we've got to think about, well, how is water then shaping the food environment and what people are doing in it more broadly beyond the production issue? One of the critical issues that the women mentioned was eating more processed foods because it was too difficult to prepare foods safely, but also the fundamental concerns about their children's health and the high rates of diarrhea that we're seeing, and therefore the kinds of malnutrition that are coexisting in our communities. So I think we need to acknowledge that water is a significant aspect of production, but it's also fundamentally shaping every stage of our food system and the experience of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Battersby, for that insight. And water indeed is one of the fundamental aspects of the food system, and it also impacts on the health outcome of the children as well as of adults. And we see how each different cities have tackled this water challenge in their own innovative ways. So thank you for all the experts for the insight. Is there any other questions or comments from the floor? Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte Flescher from Recolto. I have a question mostly for Tamsin, but maybe other speakers also want to answer it. So you were talking about your presentation about wanting to stimulate the local food economy across informal systems as well. And I'm curious to know a bit more about how you are reaching these informal communities and what are the strategies to do so. Thank you.
Great, and great question. I'd like to respond to the earlier question and then I'll respond to the second one if that's okay. So, I mean, during the drought, we encouraged people to use grey water to irrigate their gardens, but also just to note that, not to put it on the plants. If you're going to use it to water lettuces, you're probably going to need to give them a good wash beforehand. But also recognizing that the long-term use of grey water hasn't actually been tested. And we're pretty sure that there will be impacts on the structure of the soil. So it's not, for long term, it isn't something that I would certainly support. I'm not sure if the city would, my colleagues would support me, but I think we need to understand a bit more about how that works. Another point, if you're talking about climate change and the impact on viable agricultural land, I mean, Cape Town's supposedly viable agricultural land is actually sand, but people make it viable through composting and organic agriculture practices, etc. That land sits slap bang on top of Cape Town's biggest aquifer. So, if we're talking about, which up until the drought, the city of Cape Town hadn't actually been using for water supply. However, it is starting to use it, and I think the supply will actually come online in the next couple of months. So we have agriculture using the aquifer, but we're also going to have the city of Cape Town using the aquifer. And that tension hasn't really been resolved. So this whole thing of, we'll just put in a borehole needs to be very carefully considered against the impact it will have on urban water supply. The city of Cape Town did a climate risk study a few years ago, and we found that the agricultural land towards the north of the city is going to become less viable. It's going to be hotter, drier, etc. But the agricultural land in the south over the aquifer is actually going to continue to be viable. It's going to be cooler, and we have water sitting underneath it. So the question there is, how do we protect that land even more than we already have been? Because we know that by 2050, it's going to be an important part of this local food production network that we're trying to set up, which is, dealing with transport, not only transport costs, but then carbon emissions, etc. So there's a whole, as Jane was saying, everything's linked in some way or the other. And we need to be very cognizant of, how do we recharge that aquifer, and how do we manage how much is being taken out, which there's a whole grey area in the city, not even the city, in South Africa around how we manage urban water resources. And in terms of climate resilience and climate adaptation, mitigate the whole shebang, those sorts of questions have to be resolved very quickly if we're going to be resilient and meet those targets that we're aiming for. So that's just some thoughts on the water angle. To talk about the informal work, we've only been going since July, so we were just pleased that we realized that there is this issue, but we have done a lot of work already, which is great. So, in government, we have these little windows, policies come up for review, or we realize that we have something missing, so then we create a new policy and hopefully implement it very well. And some of those windows have just coincidentally come up in the last couple of months. So we've been working with our colleagues in preparing a revision for the informal trading bylaw. There's also a market framework. It would be fantastic if Cape Town could be a city of markets that are then connected to producers, which then starts to stimulate the smaller guys. The big guys we're not worried about. We're interested in how we create local economies where people live. So, reducing that need to travel, which then also talks about the carbon impact, et cetera, et cetera. So over and above the market strategy, there's preparation of what we're calling an informal sector support framework. And it's a piece of work that we kind of halfway through at present, and that is looking at how do we support informal sector more effectively. We have to also acknowledge that that the city has a bad reputation. In fact, most South African cities have bad reputations from a local government and informal sector perspective. There's the implementation to date has been quite draconian, and it's very much about enforcement rather than enabling. And we're trying to shift that to improve not only the relationship, but the way that the sector works. And, if we start to tie that back into what a food environment means, it's how we make our streets. People trade on our pavements. So maybe we need to be thinking about how we make our pavements, and instead of just putting narrow pavements and say, hey, maybe we need to widen some in these particular areas because people are going to want to trade there because maybe there's that comes through, maybe there's a station that connects. So looking at the city's infrastructure and how we can start to leverage it to improve the food environment. And that would include things like, water and electricity in particular points. And I think one of the really big, made my eyes go really big when I discovered it, was that the city of Cape Town doesn't have trading plans for informal settlements and townships. I was like, how can this be possible? If between 60 and 70% of Cape Townians are getting a large proportion of their food from the informal sector, surely we should be doing something in that space. So to my colleagues' credit, there is now a plan to put plans together for these areas to hopefully help to improve how the traders work. And then, so last comment, we also have had we've seen an amazing partnership build up between ICLEI and the Cape Town Fresh Produce Market, and they're working on a financial mechanism to hopefully improve informal traders' access to produce. So it'll, bring down costs, bring down transport, bring down, time, and hopefully bring down the price of the produce and improve the way that whole system works. So it's these little things. I think somebody was talking yesterday about these little nudges and shifts. Otherwise, it's just too overwhelming. But we're making progress, and I think the challenge always, and one of the other presenters also said this, it's great to have policies, but if you're not implementing them, then what's the point? And I think that's one of the big challenges in Cape Town is we have lots of fantastic policy and good intentions, but it's quite difficult sometimes to get them implemented on the ground. But we're still hopeful.
Thank you for that insight into the informal sector with the Cape Town. Perhaps briefly, with James, with the city of Windhoek, is there aspects of the informal sector in the food systems that is also relevant to the context of Cape Town?
The city of Windhoek, like many other cities, has got a challenge at the moment of rural-urban migration. We are about 440 at night. We could be 600 during the day. And what we've seen with the COVID pandemic, a lot of informal trading has mushroomed. And I think I want to agree with her that in terms of our town planning, we will need to either plan for more markets or make more space for informal traders to do their trading. And most of what is traded on our streets is fruits and veggies, or rather food. Of course, here and there you will find gadgets like ICT equipment, but it's mostly food being traded, particularly veggies and fruits. So what it now would mean is to formalize. First of all, we need to maybe embark upon the profiling of all these traders, and also formalizing, but doing it carefully, because with formalization comes taxation, and most of our informal traders will not necessarily want to be taxed as they start, because they produce or sell for food consumption, for income, so it should be traded very carefully. Informal traders are key to our economy, because at the end of the day, they provide us with cheap produce, and some of them would definitely be using it as a platform to earn income for their children. So informal trading to us is very important, and it's a question of us having to engage our town planners and see how we can make sure that there is access to these markets and they trade so in a safe and humanly environment. Some of the trading points may not necessarily have sanitation facilities. It may be safe, or it will be unsafe for some of the traders because they are literally in the middle of some streets. So formalization is key, and also making sure that the producers, we catch them at their farms and make sure that whatever is produced is properly packaged and transported, and sometimes it should be even stored in an efficient manner. One of our gardens has cold storages on site to avoid wastage of food as and when they are being packaged and transported. So we cannot turn a blind eye on the informal trading. Of course, it has to be systematically introduced, because our traders will immediately fear taxation, and that is a fundamental issue that should not be pushed under the carpet. So informal trading is key for the economy. It's key for poverty alleviation, and it also brings about the much needed fruits and veggies that every household would need. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And Tasman, I'm sorry, our city of Nairobi, would you share your context in terms of the informal sector? Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. In Nairobi, we have a vibrant extension service which reaches out to these informal people. And we have officers who are deployed up to the ward level. That is now the lowest level in our city. And these extension officers, they are busy promoting urban agriculture activities, urban agriculture innovations and technologies to make sure everyone is reached, including the ones in the informal settlement. We have different approaches in reaching them, especially the people in the informal settlements. We do the visits, we visit them. We also carry out trainings on daily basis, demonstrations. We also have open forums where we have the field days, the exhibitions, and even we have the Nairobi show where we have a demonstration farm by the city. The city has a demonstration farm where everyone comes and they are able to learn on the best way of carrying out urban agriculture. Number two, we reach out to the informal settlements through food security surveillance. We do it bi-monthly, and we have piloted three informal settlements. That is, one of them is Korogosho, Kibra, and Mukuru. And here we assess the food baskets. The normal ones, they are supposed to be 85. So those ones who cannot afford 85 food baskets in a month, those ones now, we classify them as food insecure. And then we have 3 levels. When we analyze the report, after carrying out the food security surveillance, it's analyzed and it's able to give 3. We have 3 indicators. We have the normal and we have the alert. When we are at normal and the alert, we do the stockpiling of the food to make sure when everything is running out normally, we do the stockpiling of the food. Then we have the emergency. That is the number 3. And when we have the emergency, then our disaster management department now has to come in and now have a response in those informal settlements. So that is what we do basically in Nairobi.
Thank you, Wim, for that. And we would like to open for last questions from the floor, if there is any questions or comments. Is there any online engagement? Just final checks. Then I would like to thank all of our speakers for presenting each city in terms of how we're preparing for the resilient cities and food systems for 2050. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Simon Heck, the Program Director at International Potato Center at the CGIAR. He will give us a presentation about the examples of the urban urban initiatives. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks again to the Milan Pact and also GAIN organizing this session to invite the CGIAR to share our experiences, but also our plans for a new research initiative. And I would like to comment already the speakers this morning on the great work they have underway, both in research as well as far as the cities are concerned in the responses to do something about urban food systems. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So the CGIAR, as you will perhaps know, is a global research and science partnership on agriculture and food with the goal to overall improve food security, nutrition in the current climate crisis, but also to contribute to poverty reduction. The CGIAR is well known for its work in rural agricultural systems, but increasingly, and it's very much now, we're also turning our attention to urban food systems. And in the context of our new strategy moving forward, we have identified a new research initiative specifically on urban and peri-urban food systems. The CGIAR, I should add, works in over 100 countries in the world. In several of these countries, we have cities that are part of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, such as the ones here today. And we are very keen on having very direct relationships and partnerships with these cities. As we engage in this arena, however, we are very mindful of some of the challenges and some of our own limitations and the way we have to change as agricultural research to be effective as a partner. Overall, you can look at this as an effort to combine and connect agriculture and food science research with urban innovation systems. A lot of agriculture research, of course, is geared towards rural systems, rural agroecologies, rural economic systems, rural social systems, rural institutional environments. As we move into urban environments, that has to change. There are challenges, but there are also huge opportunities to tap into innovation as it happens in urban systems outside of agri-food. And we do want, with your help, to fully engage with that. On our own side, we have had a number of research and innovation efforts that yielded technologies, management guidelines on specific aspects of urban food systems. But what we haven't had so far is to combine that into a more systematic and systemic approach, spanning both supply and demand side questions, both technologies and governance issues. And we've heard already this morning how important that is. And finally, that's only possible if we also strengthen the role of stakeholders such as cities, municipalities, but also in the informal sector, the role of vendors, the role of community organizations in the research process itself. So we're very committed to that. I'm not saying we have a blueprint on how that will now roll out, but what we do know is we can learn from your experiences. What we do think we have are kind of offers or immediate starting or entry points in 5 areas, building on the work we have currently underway. I go rather quickly through this. There's much more to be said to each of them. The first one is then indeed a bit more conventionally from our side on the food production, and we heard just now again that continues to be important in many of the cities, particularly in the peri-urban zones, and that things need to change because of climate and other drivers. We are very interested in particular in vegetables, fruits, livestock, and fish, as these are both high value and nutrient dense commodities that are already being grown in peri-urban areas. In many countries we work, there are issues around seasonalities. There are real gaps of food supplies, both in peri-urban production systems as well as from rural supplies. How can we help bridge some of these gaps using some of the water infrastructure that's emerging? We're also concerned about, of course, safety at the production level already. So what are alternatives to agrochemicals? There's a lot of innovation happening, also in Africa as well as in Asia on that. Livestock, fish, and crop integration is starting, but it's not yet optimized. And feed issues as well as waste capture and reuse requires more innovation, and the private sector needs to come in here. Overall, we do want to generate evidence also then for public sector stakeholders like municipal councils and cities to develop plans and regulations to further improve that peri-urban production. Of course, cities cannot just cater for their own, all of their food needs from their own production. Most of it will continue to come in from rural areas. We also know that some of these are changing because of climate, and there are particular disruptions that we now observe in supply chains. There are technologies to help address some of that that the CGIAR has been working on issues what we call food safeguarding, that looks at also improved marketing technologies and strategies, processing and simple storage. We are very much committed to really focus on the informal sector and the smaller operators. That's our remit as a publicly funded platform. There is a lot of innovation we know in the formal private sector, and we want to learn from that. But our concern is how to empower and enable the smaller operators who are the majority and who tend then also to target low-income consumers in urban areas. As part of our remit, in addition to technology development, is capacity building, both the public sector with research partners, but also with enterprise associations. And we have developed a number of approaches, guidelines to strengthen small-scale food enterprises that we think can be further developed and adapted. This session is about the food environment, and that is indeed, an area of research that's somewhat new to the CGIAR, but we have already, I think, gathered some understanding on what kind of approaches have been more effective or more cost-effective than others in trying to improve the food environment as well as consumer behavior towards more nutritious diets and more equitable outcomes. And what we are trying to do through this new initiative is to establish some kind of a platform where evidence on those efforts can be shared, accessible, and people can actually keep updating good practice examples so that cities and other stakeholders can consider investing in particular nutrition-focused interventions. Excuse me. Resource recovery and reuse, that has been mentioned just now again as a particular challenge in urban areas. Happy to say that a number of innovations have proven to be effective there in terms of water, nutrient, and energy recovery and reuse that have been verified in Africa, in Asia, and that prototypes are available for additional programs for cities, but also for enterprises to consider investing in. And we'll be happy to share these and further develop these together with you through this initiative. Finally, in terms of looking at a more systemic perspective on that, we realize, as all of you already said, that a holistic understanding of urban food systems as part of wider urban systems is really required. And I was very impressed that in some cases, like in Cape Town, there seemed to have been that kind of diagnosis and analysis already. We know from our interactions with other countries and cities, there's great demand for a kind of a more standardized diagnosis tool to help develop something we at this time call an urban food system profile for a city or a country that includes the diagnosis, the evidence, but also perhaps some recommendations for investments that can then be taken forward. So this initiative will want to work with more cities on that. Let me close by saying, the central part of making this work are the partnerships. The CGIAR being an international research platform, of course, will depend on national partners, municipalities, and your partners, both in the public, private, and informal sectors, will have to be at the center of that. We're very interested also to strengthen local research capacity so that research does not only depend on CGIAR scientists and projects and programs to be present. We do want to work with local universities so they can provide research. And we are very grateful to the collaboration with the global partners. I should include here also GAIN, in addition to the Milan Pact and RUAF and FAO and the World Bank on that. Our new initiative will start to roll out next year. We think Q2 of 2022. It will move in 3-year cycles for at least 10 years. And we look forward to working with all of you on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for sharing the key future initiatives of the CJR, and I hope that there are many collaborations and future partnerships with the cities, not only here, but also other cities and the audience that has joined here today. And I would like to thank all our speakers for sharing the experiences of the cities and the initiatives for the resilient future in preparation for the 2050. Although there are many challenges that we face today, I see also very positive, hopeful outcomes that we will have for the future as we prepare in terms of addressing the challenges and trying to look for innovative solutions. And I would like to invite our speaker, Saul, for closing of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure all of you have really enjoyed the incredibly practical and granular insights that we've got from the cities who were able to join us today. Systems thinking can be really scary sometimes because it implies that you take a really broad view and understand all of the feedback loops between different actions and plan out quite far into the future. But I think our speakers today have really helped us to understand how you can both take a systems view, but also translate that into something really practical and help people who are vulnerable to climate change and to malnutrition in these locations. I particularly enjoyed a quote from one of our Cape Town speakers who said, if you happen to be another city somewhere out there, and hopefully some of you are listening to this session this morning, how do you need to get yourself prepared for the shocks that are inevitably going to come down the line? How do you pair up with other partners so that you're not forced to try and do it alone, but you can learn from experiences that have gone before us? At GAIN, this is something that we've really taken very, very seriously and tried to work with other partners, with the Milan Pact, with RUAF, and to try and collate a lot more of these really useful experiences from cities, and to put them in one place where a whole range of city stakeholders around the world can access them and to learn more of the kind of stories that we've been listening today. So I just want to do a plug at the end of this session for this online resource, which is called Food Action Cities. I'm going to say it again so that you don't forget it, Food Action Cities, and the website is foodactioncities.org. So it couldn't be easier place to find it. And this is a resource which is full of different short accounts and some longer accounts also of different actions that cities have taken to try and meet some of the challenges across multiple dimensions, across dimensions of availability, accessibility, desirability, and so on and so on. So I really encourage you, when you have a free moment at the end of this session or the end of the day, to take a look at that resource and to join us and to also provide some of your own stories so that they can be accessed by others on this resource. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to our moderator, Assistant Professor Min Chao, and thank you to all the speakers, and thank you all of you who came early this morning to join us in the room, and thanks to those who joined us online. We hope to have the pleasure of your company at another point in the future. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.